What's up guys, welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. It's time to try out some of the skills that you've picked up during this course. This particular challenge is referred to as Grid Chessboard, and the objective is fairly straightforward. We have some HTML markup that represents a chessboard, but we currently have zero styling. The objective is to use CSS to turn this HTML markup into a chessboard. Now, although you know all of the CSS required to do this, it's still going to be quite challenging. And as CSS developers, we are going to be asked to create certain things that we don't know on surface level how to create them. And this is where there's going to be some trial and error involved and perhaps even some research. So feel free to use Google, feel free to search for advice on how to create a chessboard using CSS. The goal is to try and complete this challenge yourself before coming back to this video and seeing how we can create a chessboard using Grid. Now, the reason why it's called Grid Chessboard is we have to use Grid for this. We can't use Flexbox. It has to be Grid specifically. The objective here is to get some practice using CSS Grid. Just a really quick note here, if you have a look at a chessboard, you can see the top left square is a white square. So I guess it's not a big deal if you have a black square in the top left, but technically, if we want to be accurate here, that top left square should be a white square. All right, good luck with the challenge. I'll see you back here shortly for a solution. Okay, so let's start by exploring our markup. So we have a main div container with a class of board. We have 8 subcontainers with a class of row, and we have for each row 8 squares with a class of square. So let's start by styling board just so we can see the outline of our board. So we'll give it a border of solid 1 pixel black, and at the moment it has no height, so let's give it a height of 97 VH, and we should begin to see the outline of our board. We want this board to be a grid container, so let's set a display of grid, and let's define the grid template rows. We have 8 rows, so we can actually use the CSS function repeat. We want 8 of 1FR. Let's refresh. So we can't see our rows just yet, and that's because they also don't have a border. So let's set a border top. We can always remove this later. This is just to be able to see what we've built so far. So let's set a border solid 1 pixel black, and let's create that as border top. And let's see if our rows are in the right place. Great, so it's starting to look a bit like a chessboard. So let's focus on those squares, and we can think of a row as a grid container for the squares. So we're going to have a grid container inside a grid container. So let's set a display of grid, and let's set grid template columns this time. And we can do the same thing. We can do a repeat with 8 1FR. And let's define the square class because we can also set a border on our square. Again, we can remove this a bit later. So let's just set border solid 1 pixel black on the square for now. Let's save and refresh. Now we have a board with 64 squares. Since we have the border on the squares, we can actually remove the border from the row. And now it's just a case of coloring in the squares. And I think this is possibly the biggest part of the challenge. So some of you probably made it this far, then couldn't figure out how to color the squares. Now, perhaps you realize that the next step is to make use of nth child. So we may have tried to do something like the following: square, nth child, and we perhaps figured we could do something like 2n, and we could set every second square with a background color of black. Seems to make sense on surface value. Let's have a look at the results. Well, that's pretty close, but there's obviously something wrong with this. It doesn't quite look like a chessboard. And the reason for that is a chessboard doesn't actually go white, black, all the way through, at least not if we follow it through row by row. So at row 1, we start with a white square. At the end of row 1, we have a black square, but the beginning of row 2 should start with a black square. So it's almost like every 8 squares, we have 2 squares the same color. So how can we solve this problem? Essentially, the ordering of white and black on the row is going to depend on which row it is. Is it one of the odd rows or one of the even rows? So we actually need to take a step back here and style nth child on the row. So row nth child. Let's start by styling the odd rows. And what we can do here is combine selectors. So we can now say square nth child. And if we think about an odd row, we want every second square to be black. So here we can pass 2n, or we could actually just pass even. And we'll set background color black. Let's take a look at that. So this is only going to style the odd rows. So we're basically selecting an even numbered square on an odd numbered row. So we also need to select an odd numbered square on an even numbered row. Now we can actually combine this as one selector, but just to keep things a little bit more straightforward, we're going to create a separate selector for this. So we'll say nth child even, and then square nth child odd. And once again, we'll set background color black. There we go, perfect 8x8 chessboard. We may find as well that this does slightly overflow, and we don't actually need this border on the square now. We only put this there so we could actually see the squares, but now they have the background color. We actually don't need to be able to see the squares because it's obvious where the squares are based on whether they're white or black. So we can remove that border property on the square, and this is now a successfully completed challenge. So a little bit of a tough challenge there. Well done if you were able to solve it without assistance, but also well done if you were able to solve this after Googling. If you weren't able to solve this, don't worry. Hopefully you had some fun playing around and getting more familiar with the features of CSS Grid. Thanks very much for watching. Catch you in the next part of the course.